Morning. At first glance, our gospel reading today looks like it's pretty straightforward and some of the most practical advice that Jesus ever gives. And then he keeps on going, and it gets very, very challenging. See, at first, he says, when you are invited by anyone to a wedding feast, do not go and sit in at the best place, lest one more honorable than you be invited by him, and he who invited you come and say, hey, give this place to this man. And then you begin with shame to take the lowest place. But when you're invited, go and sit down in the lowest, so that when he who invited you comes and say, friend, go up higher, then you will have the glory and the presence of those who sit at the table with you. Well, that makes so much sense, doesn't it? I mean, if you're going to, we've all been to weddings and gotten to the reception and had that awkwardness of going, now where should we sit, right? Everybody's been there, and you've got all these tables, and sometimes your place is labeled, and you're like, okay, we don't have to figure this out. You just sit down. But you know, you want to get a nice seat, but you don't want to sit too close because somebody's going to tell you, no, this is reserved. Okay. And nobody wants to have sat down and be told to move because that's embarrassing. So at a first glance, this looks like the most practical advice Jesus gives anywhere. This is like, duh. But then he keeps on going. He said to him who invited him, when you give a dinner or a supper, do not ask your friends or your brothers, your relatives, nor your rich neighbors, lest they also invite you back and you be repaid. But when you give a feast, invite the poor, the maimed, the lame, the blind, and you'll be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you shall be repaid at the resurrection of the just. Oh, now this is challenging. Just how challenging is this? Consider this, okay? Just watch the reactions. So let's look at Kevin and Father Alan and Tim and say, okay guys, tell your wives that in the next few months when your sons have your first birthdays, that you're going to tell your wives, we're not going to invite all of your friends. Instead, we're going to go and find all the homeless people and invite them to the birthday party. See how well that goes over. And if you please, could you record it and put it on Facebook so we can see it later?
That doesn't go on Facebook.
That might have to be edited slightly, so we can live stream. Now, this is absolutely what Jesus says. And this is obviously very, very challenging because it's not birthday parties, it's when you hold a dinner or a supper, when you have a meal. If it's read a certain way, it's when you invite somebody to dinner, don't invite your friends. Invite the homeless people, the lame, the crippled, and the blind, the outcasts of society. And if that's what he means, we're all in trouble. And from a certain point of view, we all are in trouble. But while that's what Jesus says, I don't think it's actually what he means. And I think, as with most times in Scripture, I think context is king. So I think we need to look at not just the passage that we heard read in the Gospel, but I think we need to look at the whole passage in the 14th chapter of Luke. So if you would, go ahead and turn with me to Luke chapter 14. And we're starting at verse 1. Now, as it happened, Jesus went into the house of one of the rulers of the Pharisees to eat bread on the Sabbath, that they watched him closely. And behold, there was a certain man before him who had dropsy. And Jesus, answering, spoke to the lawyers and the Pharisees, saying, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? But they kept silent. And he took him and healed him, and let him go. Then he answered them, saying, which of you, having a donkey or an ox that has fallen into a pit will not immediately pull him out on the Sabbath day? And they could not answer him. And then it goes into our gospel passage. Now, realize that we have a leader of the Pharisees. This is a leader among the leaders of society. This is not the high priest, because the high priest was one of the Sadducees. But of the Pharisees, this was one of their rulers of the rulers. And he was having a Sabbath dinner. And so he invited all of the high mucky-mucks that he had to associate with. And he gathered them together. And he invites this itinerant dirt farmer, prophet, wandering around the Galilean wilderness, causing all this trouble. This is not one of his friends. This is not one of his social circles. And this is not someone that he invites because he wants to learn more about him. This is someone that he invites because he wants to trip him up. They want to catch him. In fact, they also invite someone who has dropsy. Now, this is one of those things, this is one of those names for an ancient disease that we actually still have today. Dropsy was what they called hydropsia, which is basically a lot of swelling. It was what we would call today edema. Basically, he had a very, very large amount of swelling in a foot, maybe even both of his feet. And the great thing about this passage is that it barely addresses Jesus' healing. He's at this feast, this Sabbath feast, with these high mucky-muck rulers of this sect of Jewish society. And they've got this man who is terribly ill. And this sick man is essentially bait. They're like, what's he going to do with the sick guy? Because it's the Sabbath and he's not allowed to do work. Let's see what you do there, prophet. And so Jesus goes to this fancy dinner, which, by the way, this is the Sabbath. This is a day which is supposed to be holy. It's a day which is supposed to be reverent. They're not supposed to do any work on this day. The meal was supposed to be prepared in advance, so that when you sat down, everything was already ready. It's not exactly supposed to be a fancy dinner. But there's this man who's there who's sick, and Jesus just heals him and lets him go. You're healed, go away. And then he turns and he chastises him. It doesn't say that he laid hands on him. He doesn't say, go in peace, your faith has made you well. He doesn't make mud or clay out of the dirt and spit in his hands. It doesn't say anything. It just says he healed him and sent him on his way. And then he turns and looks at these guys and says, which of you, if you had, some versions actually say a son, if you had an animal who fell into a ditch on the Sabbath, wouldn't immediately pull him out of the ditch? They're all like, if your child was injured, wouldn't you help them out? Yeah, okay. Then why would we not heal someone who is sick on the Sabbath? They're trying to trap him, and he shuts them down. This whole thing is a trap. And he follows up with that and says, now look at you. You are trying to make yourself look more impressive by this. And he follows up and he says what we already talked about. He said, when you're invited to a wedding feast, do not sit down at the best place, lest one more honorable than you be invited by him. And he who invited you come and say, give this place to this man, and you begin with shame to take the lowest place. We talked about that. And then he says, then he said to him who invited him. So now he's speaking to the ruler of the synagogue, the ruler of the Pharisees, who has graciously invited him to this fancy Sabbath dinner, which is in and of itself a bit of a contradiction. When you give a dinner or a supper, when you have a meal, do not ask your friends or your brothers, your relatives, or your rich neighbors, lest they invite you back and you be repaid. But when you give a feast, invite the poor, the maimed, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you. For you shall be repaid at the resurrection of the just. Now we have to think about what was his intention here. What was the expressed purpose of this event in the mind of God? What was the expressed purpose here in the mind of the ruler of the synagogue? And what does Jesus say? Because if we look at what the purpose of the Sabbath day is, the purpose of the Sabbath was to honor God. The purpose of the Sabbath was to consecrate a day and focus on the holiness of God. To say, look, 6 days you can work. 1 day is dedicated to God. 1 day is a day which we honor, we sanctify, we say, this is the Lord's day. We're going to honor it and keep it holy. We're not going to work on this day. We're going to say, this is a day that we set aside, and we do no work, and we set it aside for the work of the Lord. Now, in some cases, the rigmarole that went into not doing work seems like it becomes far more work than just doing a little work. But that's a different story altogether. The rigmarole of preparing all of the things that you need to do so that you can not work becomes a whole lot more work. But that's a different question. The idea was, this is consecrated to the Lord. And this ruler of the synagogue has sat there and he said, I am going to take a meal that is consecrated to the Lord, and I am going to use it to ensnare the Lord of the Sabbath. He has turned the purpose of the event completely on its head. And he's like, I'm going to get him. And Jesus is not to be got, by the way. He's not going to be trapped. Now, if we look at Matthew chapter 6, we can see a little bit more about this. We see that this man has taken an event which was supposed to honor God, and he is trying to ensnare God. His purpose is to make himself look glorious in front of his friends. His purpose is to show all of these other high muck-me-mucks among his sect, among the Pharisees, I got him. He's arranged this elaborate feast to trap Jesus. Now, we had an occasion yesterday where several of us went out and we prayed at the local abortion clinic, which we have decided we are going to focus on. And we are going to direct all of our efforts in our efforts to shut down one clinic, and then snowball our efforts to shut down another clinic. We're going to try as hard as we can to shut down one clinic and then move on to the next clinic and shut that clinic down until, by God's grace, there are no abortion clinics left in Jacksonville. And so we have chosen the weakest link, the clinic that is, by our approximation, the most vulnerable clinic to be shut down in Jacksonville. And we went to this clinic yesterday, and it was closed. That meant there was no one there. There were no employees, there were no clients, there was nobody there. It was just the 15 or 20 of us who were there praying the liturgy for the preborn. And I had very mixed feelings when I arrived and realized this. And I told the people who were there about this. On one hand, I was a little disappointed. And on one hand, I was very relieved. My relief was that nobody was dying that day. No children would be murdered in that clinic that day, thanks be to God. Amen. My disappointment was that we couldn't speak to anyone as they were going in. There would be no ministry to anyone who was going in. No one might have their minds changed, and no one would see the prophetic witness that we were doing as they drove by. No one would see that, and that was a little disappointing. But then I was reminded that we're not praying this service so that everyone sees our prayers and is like, oh,
preach it.
What good Christians they are.
Yeah.
In fact, most people who drive by probably think the opposite. But we're praying because God sees us and hears our prayers, and it's He who makes a difference.
Yeah.
It's He who changes things. And we see that when we look at Matthew chapter 6. Jesus says, take heed that you do not do your charitable deeds before men to be seen by them. Otherwise you have no reward from your Father in heaven. Therefore, when you do a charitable deed, do not sound a trumpet before you as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may have glory from men. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward. But when you do a charitable deed, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, that your charitable deed may be done in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly.
Amen.
And when you pray, you shall not be like the hypocrites, for they love standing in the synagogues and on the corners of the streets, that they may be seen by men. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward. But when you pray, go into your room, and when you have shut the door, pray to your Father who is in the secret place. And when your Father sees in secret, will reward you openly. Now, along those same lines, now we may have been on a street corner, but that street corner is kind of tucked away, and we didn't really have anybody drive by yesterday. We may have well been praying in secret. But our Father who sees in secret is going to hear those prayers. And in the fullness of time, those prayers are going to make a difference by God's grace. Amen?
Amen.
And what we see in this passage and what we lived out yesterday is what Jesus is talking about here. In theory, this ruler of the synagogue ought to have been doing a charitable deed for the sake of doing this charitable deed, and instead he was doing it so that his friends, his colleagues could go, man, he is a savvy little trickster. He got that Jesus, made him look stupid. Now we all know he's just a huckster and a charlatan. Yeah, well, he had his reward, didn't he? He was made to look foolish. Because the wisdom of men is but the foolishness of this world. And he was looking like a fool. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't get to have any obligation to the poor. It doesn't mean that Jesus is saying, hey, this doesn't really apply to you guys because you're not trying to ensnare Jesus. We still have an obligation to reach out to the poor, to take care of the sick, the lame, the homeless. We still have an obligation to reach out. Probably more rigorously than we do there's always more that can be done. However, he's not exactly saying, all of you, when you have dinner, be sure that you don't invite your friends and invite the homeless instead. It's not what he means. What he's saying here is this ruler is trying to make himself look glorious. And that's wrong. Whether you're self-promoting or whether you're talking about how awesome you are, any time that you try and make yourself look better, that self-exaltation ends badly. We see it when we look at our lesson from Proverbs, which goes right along with what we hear Jesus say. Our reading from Proverbs tells us, do not exalt yourself in the presence of the king. Do not stand in the place of the great. For it is better that he say to you, come up, than you should be put lower in the presence of the prince, whom your eyes have seen. Him who exalts himself will be knocked down. He who humbles himself will be exalted. Anytime you're trying to go, look how great I am, there's already someone who's ready to go, no, hold on. But anytime you say, no, I'm doing just fine, I'm doing what I'm supposed to do, I'm working diligently, there's someone ready to go, look at this guy. Because remember that while God calls us his sons and daughters and he adopts us as his own, we're still his laborers in the vineyard. We're still his servants who are called to do his work. We're still those whom he entrusts to labor in his fields and to bring in the harvest. And I know that there's always more work that I should be doing. And any time that I think, man, I have really done all that I should do today, I'm wrong. And there's always more that could be done. And any time I want to feel the urge to pat myself on the back, there's hundreds of thousands of people out here in this city alone who desperately need the love of God.
Come on,
who
man.
desperately need a touch from his wounded hands. And they're going to get it from us.
That's right.
And they need us. We need to remember that he calls us to stay humble. He calls us to remember that we're ultimately going to thrive with him in heavenly mansions, but only because of his love for us and that he will exalt us to heavenly palaces because of what he's done. And our exalted place is because he died for us. And when we die with him, we will rise with him. And our exaltation is because of his suffering. And we need to remember that anything we get is a gift from him, and stay humble. And our humility will lead to him raising us up. And that's the only way to be exalted in the kingdom of God.
Amen.
Amen? In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.